Great to see so many faces. This is a pretty exciting session we got going here today. So it's scale. Scale is one of the biggest issues in development that most organizations are facing these days. If you look at MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, they dominate the discourse about how people talk about development. They predicate that development is urgent and a very big problem. And as a result, organizations respond by standardizing, rushing, implementing based on targets so that they can meet the MDGs. So, I think, well, maybe I'll kind of tell a little bit of story what that looks like, I guess, before we get into this. I worked with an organization in Malawi that was doing water. And when I got there, they had just finished a project that was about, I think they targeted about maybe 30,000 people. And the project was a major success, really high quality. They were really like making behavior changes in the community. When I got there, they moved on to a new project. And the way that they distinguished themselves from other organizations when they bid for the project was that they wanted to prove that they were the best bang for the buck, basically. And so when they got to that project, basically what they did was they increased the scale of the project from 30,000 people to about 300,000 people. They reduced the amount of facilitators they had per village. So instead of having 30 villages per facilitator, they went up to 120 villages per facilitator. Everything became target-based, and at the end of the day, these facilitators couldn't keep up, and they were drilling wells, they were marking things off a list, and all the staff knew that things weren't going very well. When the donors came to visit, staff would spend a whole month preparing for the donor visit. They would ignore their project just so that they could rearrange how the project looked from an external perspective. So they go out to the villages and they would actually coach villages to say certain things when the donor came, just because the project had gotten so bad. So it was pretty dismal. Like it was really frustrating. And I think the most frustrating part was when I was finishing up the project. The organization actually put in a bid for a new project where they actually doubled the scale again. So double the money, half the money, double the villages, because they were having trouble getting funding. This is a major issue. It's a major pattern throughout the sector. A lot of you guys have been overseas. I'm sure a lot of you guys, this resonates. We all know it happens all the time. So all this talk we've been talking throughout the conference around systems and this new paradigm, a lot of this is around how do we solve this issue of massive urgency and scale that's needed, but do it with the quality that's required to actually have the impact and the sustainability that also needs to come along with it. So we have two amazing speakers with us today. The reason that I've asked them here is that they both have ideas on how we can do things differently. And that's the big key. We keep talking about what the problems are, and this is really about moving towards what could this look like if we did it in a different way. So our first speaker is going to be Martin Fisher. Martin Fisher is the founder of Kickstart, or co-founder. He's been at it for 17 years? 25 years? 25 years, wow. I saw Martin speak at Kickstart 17 years? Yeah. I saw Martin speak at NYU, where I'm going to school right now, and was blown away, and just had to have him come and interact with you guys, because he's really doing some incredible things. And the interesting thing is he is an engineer. His business is about disseminating technology, but he has done an amazing job of coupling that with all of the downstream innovations that have to go with that in order to make sure that it is possible to scale it and have farmers adopt and demand products. So it's pretty neat. And then he's been, many accolades under his belt, from Schwab Foundation, Swell Foundation. He's been honored by Time Magazine. He's kind of a big deal. So he's also going to be the keynote closing speaker today. So he's going to speak for 20 minutes. And then we have Arvind Singhal, Dr. Arvind Singhal. So he is the Distinguished Fellow at the Clinton School of Public Service, is that the official name? That's his part-time job. And then he is also director of the Global Social Justice Initiative, that's right. He spoke earlier about positive deviance and behavior change, and he is really a great thinker on diffusion of innovation, and also has a wonderful personality and tells lots of stories, and is very, very good guy. So I think you'll enjoy his talk. So he'll talk for a few minutes. We won't have a lot of time for questions, because it's a short session, but hopefully we can get some in. And then we'll also have some time for questions after the keynote this evening if you want to ask Martin more as well. So I'm going to stop talking and give room to the speakers. So Martin, okay.
Great. Thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for coming. Great conference. So as you say, I'm going to talk about scale. And when we're talking about scale, the first question we need to ask is why should we bother to scale? What should we scale? And how do we scale it? And so I'm going to talk about these three things. Now, why scaling is probably the easiest. The world's biggest problems need large-scale and lasting solutions. So we need to take things to scale. So that's pretty easy. But what to scale is much more difficult. And we only want to scale things that really have high impact. So what kind of high impact interventions can we scale? I've got this little thing up here that says real good, not feel good. This is a website which describes what I'm going to talk about for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So you can go there and learn a lot more about this. But when you're trying to think about what it is that you should or shouldn't scale, in my mind, you can really ask 4 simple questions. And from those questions, you can really analyze any social enterprise, any kind of intervention, and decide, is this something we should spend money on scaling? Very simple, and it's also a great sort of filter to put any kind of project through. So, 4 questions. First question is, have we got measurable and proven impacts? Now, everybody loves to talk about those things, but what do we really mean? If you talk to most organizations, if you talk to most projects, it's very hard for them to actually define what it is they're trying to change. And I always think it's a very useful exercise to try to put in about 8 words or less the mission of your organization. So, we're trying to have poor people make a lot more money. We're trying to save lives from malaria, right? We're going to have a lot more kids graduate from high school. And that is the primary thing that the organization is in doing. In that case, you have to be able to measure and prove that you're actually doing that. Because if you don't have measurable and proven impacts, it's certainly not worth scaling. Now, how do you actually measure these things? Some measurements are difficult, but the reality is if you're having a big change, and we only want to scale things that are actually making a big change, then it's not that difficult to measure those things. And it's absolutely critical that if somebody isn't measuring, it's not worth scaling it. Second question is, are these impacts cost effective? How much does it cost to take one person out of poverty, have one person make a lot more money? How much does it cost to save one life? How much does it cost to get one person in America into a job? Okay, and how do you figure out that cost? Well, the best way to figure out the cost is to take the total donor funds, because that's really the subsidy, and divide by the total impacts. Okay, so we talked about the bang for the buck, right? So it costs this much money to save a life. Now, a lot of people like to talk about overheads and all sorts of things like that, and frankly, that really doesn't matter. The issue is, what is the total subsidy divided by the total impacts? How much did it cost you to get one family so they make a lot more money? How much did it cost you to save one life from malaria? And is that a good deal or a bad deal? Is it expensive or cheap? Now there, you have to say, what does it compare to other projects, right? So is taking a family out of poverty for $1,000 a good deal or a bad deal? Well, it's a bad deal if someone else in the same circumstance can do it for $300, right? But you have to be able to do this, and like I say, it's really the total donor funds divided by the total impacts. Very simple calculation. You need to have a sustainable exit strategy if you want to scale something. And what I mean by this is eventually the donor funds aren't going to be there anymore in a particular location. And so by sustainable exit strategy, what I'm really talking about is sustainable impacts. And the simplest way to think about that is that the beneficiaries in the area where you're working will continue to benefit when there are no more donor funds. And secondly, new beneficiaries living in that same area will also be able to benefit without any more donor funds. Right? So that's really sustainable impacts. You leave in place a place where the present beneficiaries continue to benefit and future beneficiaries can also start to benefit. Now it turns out there's only 4 possible ways to have a sustainable exit strategy. There's only 4 possible ways to leave something sustainable in the community. So what are they? Well, the first way is you leave in place a profitable business and supply chain. So the goods and services that you were providing, which are helping people so much, are now locally available and people can go down to the local shop and buy them. Okay, that's sustainable. No donor funds are required. So that's one possible way. Another way is you hand over to government funding. You establish a bunch of clinics, you have them running really well, you hand over to the government, and they use taxpayers' money to pay for it. Taxpayers' money is reasonably sustainable, not that sustainable, not all that sustainable in Africa necessarily, but nonetheless, you can hand over and have the government pay for these things. Another way is you leave in place a sustainable community process that requires no outside funding. So, what would that be? Well, a good example of that would be, for example, merry-go-round lending. So you go in, you organize the women to sit in a group. Every week, each of them puts $5 into the middle. One woman takes out the total amount of money, and she gets it that week. The next week, everybody puts in $5. The next woman gets it. You can go in, you can train people. There's that. There's something more complicated, which is the lockbox version of that. You go in, you train people. You walk away from it, and they go on benefiting, and it's simple enough that other people in that community can also replicate it and start benefiting from it. So sustainable community process. The only other exit strategy is you solve the problem. Okay, so what do? You could get rid of smallpox. That kind of worked. Right? You could eradicate something, or you could completely change a meme so that it becomes the norm that when a child goes to the toilet, their mother says, "Wash your hands." And that just becomes part of the culture, right? So you've changed a meme, or to change the way people act. So that would solve the problem. Or you could maybe pass a law and enforce it, right? Which would stop people from polluting, for example, as long as you're in a place where laws can be enforced. But there are no other sustainable exit strategies, and a project should always be able to tell you which of these 4 strategies they're going for. Because depending on the strategy you're going for in the end, you're going to use different methodologies to get there. Right? So any project, you should be able to ask them this question, and they should be able to tell you, it's going to take a long time. These are big, hard problems I'm trying to solve. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But eventually, this is how I'm going to leave a sustainable process in place. Finally, you want the problem, the solution, to be scalable in one location. So, not just dependent on something very small and replicable in another location. We want very, very simple models. To replicate something, it has to be simple. It can't be highly dependent on the local infrastructure or the local priest who was a great guy and everything worked as long as he was there, but when he disappeared, it fell apart. These really have to be very, very simple models that you can pick up and replicate somewhere else with minor modification. If you can answer all 4 of these questions, then we have something which is worth scaling that can really create large-scale and lasting change. Like I said, you can read a lot more about that at Real Good Nutshell. So now the question is how to scale. Well, you need a few things in order to scale. You certainly need money. You certainly need partners. You certainly need time. Okay. And the right mix of money, partners, and time is going to depend on what that sustainable exit strategy looks like. So, very few things have in fact gone to any kind of large scale. In general in development, we have what we call islands of success. We have a great little project, it's doing fantastic things, we can measure the impacts, and you go 50 kilometers away, nobody's ever even heard of it. You go to the next country, nothing happens. Right? We've got to get beyond that. But very few things have got far beyond that. One of them, and I'm going to just run down a few examples, iodized salt. Not something you usually think about, but it had an absolutely huge impact on the world. They were developed in the 1920s by the US. in the US by universities and the private sector, and really taken over by the private sector. The private sector runs this at scale. 2/3 of the people in the world benefit from iodized salt. And it was immediately, the private sector was brought in as a partner from the very beginning, even though WHO and UNICEF were very, very involved. Another thing that's gone to scale that we all know about, of course, is vaccinations. Right? Local governments can take over vaccinations in the end, that's the exit strategy, or in the case of polio, you can eradicate or try to eradicate. So there's two exit strategies there. And the money comes from, well, the history of it is it came from India, the US government, and then the big players came in, and all the other donors came in, private sector came in, of course, to produce the vaccines, so you have to have the private sector there. And local governments eventually come in and actually provide these vaccinations as they go forward. Another thing that's scaled, microfinance, which have become for-profit banks, right? They've become businesses. And microfinance, I always say, is the original social enterprise. And it's not surprising because a poor person's #1 need is in fact money, because everything they do, they depend on money to do it. When they want to send their kids to school or buy a piece of clothes or build a house or anything, or eat even. And so you're selling the poor people their #1 need, which is money. So it's not surprising that microenterprise is such a success, because you're meeting the #1 need of the poor. But in the beginning, microenterprise started its NGOs. Other NGOs took it over and scaled. Every NGO in the world was involved in microfinance. And then individual MFIs came up. They actually started as microfinance institutions with donor funds from everybody, philanthropy, bilaterals, multilaterals. And then they became banks just recently. And now you suddenly have money, debt and equity money and IPOs. Right? And you got 100 million borrowers. But the key thing to remember about microfinance is this took 35 years and hundreds of millions of dollars of philanthropy and donor funds to get where it is today. Okay, because it takes a long time to get things to scale. There's only a few other things that have gone to scale. I won't even read the whole list, but the green revolution, obviously, all rehydration. Some of the new things down the bottom here, conditional cash transfers. This is very recent stuff, which have been scaled through the public sector. Deworming kids in schools. These have really only taken off in the last 5 years, and they've already covered 30 countries, 26 countries, some of these things. But that's been scaled through the private sector. Through the public sector, sorry. But it's a very short list, and of course cell phones comes down the bottom there, because that's also scaled very quickly. But very few things have gone to scale. Kickstart is the organization that I run. We have a mission to take millions of families out of poverty and change the way development is done. And we do this by developing very low-cost capital equipment and selling it to very poor entrepreneurs who use it to buy very profitable businesses. So what kind of business can your average African start? Well, the vast majority of Africans, 80% of them, 80% of the poor ones, and in fact a third of the people in the world, of course, are poor, small-scale farmers, and they generally farm about an acre or two. And if that's where they are, those are the people who have to start these businesses if we really want to create a lot of businesses in Africa. So how can you make farming a business? The best way is to irrigate. Why? Because with irrigation, you grow high-value crops throughout the year. You can time your crops to bring them out when there are no other crops on the market. You can get very high prices for them, and you can get 3 or 4 crop cycles in the year. You can make a ton of money with irrigation. But there's no technology, so we developed Moneymaker pumps. This little Stairmaster pump here. You walk back and forth, you pull water out of a well, you spray it through a hose pipe, you can irrigate 2 acres of land. This is a $100 pump, $98 retail. We call them Moneymaker because people only actually want one thing, and that's to make money. And what we're really selling is a better life. We have another pump here. This is what we call our hip pump. This is a $34 pump. You can irrigate 1 1/4 acres with this pump. It also pulls water out of a well, sprays it through a hose pipe, and irrigates 1 1/4 acres. With these pumps, on average, families increase their farm income by a factor of 10. They're growing high-value crops, they're getting high yields, and they're bringing them out 3 times a year, and they're growing them in the seasons where nobody else has crops, so very high prices for them. Family incomes by a factor of 2 to 4, so huge impacts. But to get from a product to impacts, first of all, we have to make them, of course. we have to distribute them, and we have to sell them. And to do that, we need partners from the beginning. For manufacture, doing high-quality mass production. We actually started this in Africa, but we now produce in large factories in China. There's all sorts of reasons, but you actually cannot do high-volume mass production at a low cost yet in Africa. It's unfortunate, but true. We proved you could do it, but not at a low enough cost. Distribution, you need partners. Retail and wholesale shops, aggregate shops, a place where people already go to buy their seeds and fertilizer all across Africa. So we buy from the factory, we sell to wholesalers. We have 400, 450 of these little retail shops in every village, every marketplace, every town, the places where we work. And everybody makes money. It's a for-profit supply chain, so everybody's motivated. But a good product and a good supply chain is simply not enough. Coca-Cola. It took Coke a good 10 to 15 years to go to scale in Africa and even to become profitable in Africa. And they're selling an addictive, sticky drink, right? We're selling a never-before-seen piece of technology. We really have a very, very difficult sales job here ahead of us. And why is it so hard? Well, like I said, it's a never-before-seen thing. People have never seen these irrigation pumps. It's a big-ticket item. It's expensive. We're selling to the very poorest, the most risk-adverse, the hardest to reach people in the world, and these are people with no real savings and no credit and no margin for error. If they buy and it doesn't work, they're going to go hungry for months. And very limited word of mouth also. It turns out that when you make money, and you're a poor person in Africa and you make money, you don't go out and tell everybody, hey, I made a lot of money. Why? Because your extended family will come to you and demand, hey, pay my school fees, give me money. Your neighbors will come to you and demand that. So you actually don't advertise it. So the word of mouth about making money is very, very slow. Very different than we had the situation in Bangladesh, where these irrigation pumps have scaled up much more rapidly, because their people are very densely populated, living on top of each other, and the word of mouth issue is not nearly as big. It happens much quicker. So we need to do a huge amount of marketing and sales in order to scale. We have to make this an aspirational product. So we have really good-looking farmers on our advertisements with big piles of produce, billboards. We do competitions where people get together and compete in public to see who can pump more water. At the marketplace, we get prizes. We use radio advertisements, talk shows, call-in shows. We have a live demo at the storefront here, you can see, where they actually demonstrate the pump right there. We go on market storms where we line up trucks with loudspeakers and go through the rural areas, blaring music and talking about these things, jumping off, spraying water on people, talking about them. We do farm demonstrations, get out to the farm, show it to people. You do all those things. That's a lot of stuff. You need a really high-performing team. So you have a great management team, you need excellent staff, you need great systems, you need to do all sorts of great recruitment and training, you need ERP systems, learning improvement organization. Putting all this stuff in place, all that marketing, all these people, all these systems, it's a lot of money. It's not cheap. So, introducing a completely new product into a new market takes a lot of time and a lot of money. We're just going to take a look at that on this plot here. So if we're on the vertical axis there, we've got the number of sales and cost of sale, and we've got time on the horizontal axis. In the beginning, the red line is sales. So sales start off very low. The cost is pretty low in the beginning too. Why? Because you're selling to the very easy to reach early adopters. These are the guys who are hanging out on the side of the road with extra money, right? You don't actually have to go very far. You can sell to them in the bus station. But very quickly, you get to the slightly harder to reach early adopters. These guys are off the road, right? And your sales still haven't really picked up very much. And you need a bigger organization. You have to hire all these people. You have to get vehicles. You have to get off the road. You have to get out there and convince all these people, right? And then, as the sales grow, still very slowly, some economies of scale kick in. You now have a working organization. It now gets cheaper per sale, but not very much cheaper. And then, as the sales are taken off slowly, all of a sudden, you get to a tipping point, a critical mass of some kind, where word-of-mouth sales start to take off. And the sales take off very rapidly, and competition kicks in as the costs drastically go down, because now the word of mouth is happening, and you've created a whole new industry. Now this plot is true for any product anywhere in the world. they all follow this basic curve, right? That you have to spend a lot of money to build market demand. It's just that in Africa, it takes even longer and it's even more money. There's a real market failure in Africa, which is demonstrated by this, and private companies simply don't manufacture and sell things, big ticket items. They don't design big ticket items for poor farms in Africa. It just does not happen. Why? Because it's only profitable at scale, right? It's only profitable when you can sell a lot of these things. Why? Because you've got very small margins. You can't protect your IP even at scale. There's way too much money and time to build the demand. You lose money on every sale. And that's why today, farmers in Africa are still using two tools, a machete and a hoe. After all these years, nobody's figured out how to sell them a third tool and make money. So you have to use donor funds to overcome this market failure, to reach that critical mass or the tipping point. It takes time and money, and you use a smart subsidy from the donors to do all this marketing until such time as you get to a tipping point and this thing becomes actually profitable. And at the end, you leave in place this fully sustainable and profitable supply chain. It takes a lot of time and not money. So you need donor money. It starts off usually with individual philanthropy. Of course, then it goes to foundations and corporate foundations. And then after a while, when it's proven, the bilaterals kick in. Am I too long? Okay. And then when it's really proven, the multilaterals kick in with money. And using donor funds, therefore, you need to measure impacts, and you need to measure your cost effectiveness, as I said before, otherwise it's not worth doing. So where are we today with impacts from Kickstart? Farmers are trying to make more money. That's our mission, right? So far, we've sold 165,000 of these pumps, 105,000 successful farm businesses, 60,000 acres under irrigation, on average $900 in new annual profits per year. For family, almost over 500,000 people out of poverty with those families. If you look at the revenues generated, equivalent to 0.6% of the GDP in Kenya and 0.25% of the GDP in Tanzania from these little pumps already, and it costs a total of $350 to take a family out of poverty. That's a donor fund. Now that cost, as I said, it covers everything. It covers the R&D, it covers the fundraising, it covers the impact measurement, it covers absolutely everything we do, although most of it, at least half of it, is the marketing and sales. The global potential for these pumps is something like 40 million. We're scratching the surface. So we need to continue to say. Now I'm sure some of you are sitting here saying, wait a minute, what about cell phones? Didn't cell phones go to scale without any of this donor funds? How did that happen? Right? So it's interesting. Cell phones, we have to study them and we have to learn from them. But cell phones are really an exception that prove the rule. So what is it? To begin with, cell phones were already developed for wealthy people in wealthy markets. They weren't developed for poor people in Africa, right? They would never have been, right? They were already fully developed here and fully scaled in the developed world, as you see. And so, second thing that happened is when we first brought cell phones to Africa, the early adopters were who? They were the very wealthy people like myself, because I was there using a fixed line phone in Africa, and you would get cut off if you could get through, which you usually couldn't. It was absolutely frustrating. We heard about cell phones. We wanted them. We were willing to pay any money for a cell phone, not only for the cell phone itself, but for the minutes. And so you had very wealthy early adopters, right? So this covered the initial cost of coming in. And it also immediately made cell phones aspirational. They become a status symbol because the wealthy people are walking around showing off their cell phones. Everybody suddenly wants a cell phone. The next adopters of cell phones were entrepreneurs, people who could buy a cell phone and use it as a payphone. It's a money-making device, right? And why? Because people would come and pay for a phone call. Why did they come and pay for a phone call? Because it was cheaper than getting on the bus and going to the city to take a message. Now they could make a phone call. So you had entrepreneurs, there was a money-making device, a money-saving tool that people were willing to pay for it. Next, cell phones and the whole technology around them have built-in credit. You build out a cell phone infrastructure, well, guess what? You get paid back forever. Right? You don't have to fund it in the beginning because people are buying minutes. Right? So it's got built-in credit. And finally, it's got a great networking effect. If I have a cell phone, I want everyone I know to have a cell phone. Right? Why? Because I want to call them. So you talk about it. It's not like a money-making device. So these are some great properties. If we could build these properties into other technologies, it'd be much, much easier to get them to spread. But going back to our pumps, Well, our pumps actually only have one of these properties, which is a great money-making device. And that's very useful. It takes people out of poverty, but early adopters are not wealthy people. They use petrol pumps. And it's not expensive. No word. So we need to partner to accelerate sales and growth. So we sell our pumps to all the big NGOs and UN agencies. We leverage their fundraising. They go raise the money to do the dissemination, right? And we sell it to them by the bulk, by the container load. We sell to governments by the container load. And then we appoint distributors and dealers. So we can see the countries we're active in: Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, Burkina. And meanwhile, these other countries we have, actually now this is only 6, but we have 8 countries where we have appointed distributors. And they go on and sell to local NGOs and CBOs and groups. We partner with MFIs in order to enable people to have credit. And we partner with big companies, people like John Deere, Monsanto, Syngenta, Yara selling fertilizer, ITT, the biggest pump company in the world, IDO, Fintrack. And eventually, we're not doing this yet, but we're also going to start earning and selling carbon credits. But partnering is absolutely critical. The other thing that we use for accelerating growth is technology. We've introduced hot prospecting. Each of our salespeople goes out and identifies hot prospects, people who want to buy a pump, but they haven't been convinced fully yet, but they have a cell phone. We get 5 names per salesperson per day. We've got a huge database of cell phones and why people don't want to buy pumps. We have a web-based system where you can now, it's like Salesforce, you can go in from Cyber Cafe and you download and you have your work plan for the next week. How are you going to close these sales? Who are you going to visit? Who are you going to phone? Who are you going to SMS? Cell phone marketing. Once people have phones, you can call them. You can talk to them. You can get customer information from them. Cell phone layaway. Saving money is really difficult. But in Africa, and especially in Kenya, you can transfer money now using a cell phone. And so why don't you do layaway? You can make micro savings in order to save up for your very expensive pump. It's really hard to save money in your mud hut. You put it under the mattress, a lot of it disappears. So now people can make micro payments using their cell phone, so they're fully paid for a pump and then go get it. We can use this to improve the impact of the pumps, farming information. Once someone has a pump, how do they best use it? And from there, farmer-to-farmer referrals. We're just starting a program now where we get farmers to refer other farmers, and they actually earn points. We're just looking at it, it's like, almost like a social networking game. And we're then actually just starting to think about building out a social network, Moneymaker Farmers Club, using people who buy our pumps and the huge database we have of the people who want to buy pumps, and using SMSs and voice. So certainly technology can be a huge, huge accelerator. So, just to conclude, only scale high-impact interventions, and it takes money, partnerships, time, technology to make it happen.
Wow, to follow Martin Fisher, no? I guess I should just say amen. And I'm going to talk in a somewhat different tone. And I encourage you to engage with, well, your heads, of course, but also with your heart. We do a lot to cultivate the habits of the mind, and as His Holiness the Dalai Lama would say, we do very little, or we do a very poor job of cultivating the habits of the heart. So see if you can cultivate, see if you can scale the habits of your heart as we move forward. So, Martin's presentation, phenomenal, no? In terms of we've got a technology, how do we scale it? Radiate outward, profits, sustainability, and that's terrific. We do need it. So I'm talking about something different. Inward scaling. It's the first time I'm talking about this. So maybe my talk needs to be scaled. There's a classic story of a 70-year-old man, can be a woman, but let's stay with the man, who's looking back, reflecting back on his life. And he says, when I was 20 years old, I wanted to change the world. And by the time I was 30, I realized the world was too big a place for me to change. So I would just focus on my country. And then when I was 40 years old, I realized that my country, India, such a big place, to try to change, I will just focus on my city. And by the time I was 50, I realized that my city, New Delhi, Calcutta, Toronto, such a big place to change, so I will focus on my community. And by the time I was 60, I realized that my community, my neighborhood, place where I grew up and where I know people, very difficult place to change, so I will work on my family. And now that I'm 70 years old, I've realized that my family, people whom I have known, who are the nearest and dearest to me, are the most difficult people to change. So it's time for me to work on myself. So he begins to flip the scenario and say, what if I had begun to work on myself when I was 20? Maybe by the time I was 30, people around me, my family, my friends, would have begun to change. And by the time I was 40, perhaps people in my neighborhood, excited about me and my family and my friends, perhaps they would begin to change. And by the time I'd be 50, perhaps people in my city, and by the time I'm 60, people in my country. And now that I'm 70 years old, maybe the world would say that here is somebody who took things to scale. So we can think of scale in terms of outer scaling, sure. But perhaps we may give a little attention with our heart to the notion of scaling inwards. It's in your control. As Gandhi would say, no? Mr. Gandhi, how did India become independent? How could you take 350 million people and, sort of have them rise against? He said, wow, it was all very easy. It was all very easy, very easy. And I was always in control. You see, I never tried to change anybody. I just worked on myself. And when I worked on myself, things around me began to change. So there's empirical proof. Aha! Mother Teresa. Maybe she can teach us a thing or two about scale. Inner scaling. I began a correspondence relationship with Mother Teresa when I was 15. And it lasted for about 6 years, and we exchanged several dozen letters. And so I'm always looking out for stories on Mother Teresa. And she has many, many things to say. And of course, to do with respect to scale. And of course, my favorite quotation from Mother Teresa is, "We all cannot do great things, but we can all do small things with great love." Is she talking about a different kind of scaling? The social justice initiative that I direct, this is our new line of products. Carry small things with great love. This is called shameless scaling. No? You want to buy this? Let's see if you recognize. Come on, it's not going to cost you if you even try. Can I give you a hint? M&M's.
Margaret Mead.
Margaret Mead, M&M's, see? Mm-hmm. And do we know what Margaret Mead said about scaling? Or how she added to our thinking about scaling? Would somebody read it out loud? Never doubt.
Never doubt that a small, thoughtful, concerned citizens in the world indeed is not a thing better.
Hey, I mean, that's a different kind of inner scaling. Of course, this is my favorite now. There's a lot of this happening. I'm guilty, too. Okay, so inner scaling, huh? Should we talk about symbolic scaling? You ready? Should we? Yeah. Okay. Look at this guy now. He's listening to this presentation. Okay, scaling salt. Yeah, do you have a sense of where I may be going with this? Some of you, yeah? Please tell us.
Well, I think you're probably going to cutting people and they don't salt from you.
Yeah, and why did he do that? That was part of it. But why salt as a way of taking on the British government? Because the British taxed salt in India, much like they taxed tea. Yeah? And you know that Boston Tea Party was with Indian tea. Yeah, sun never set on Queen Victoria's empires. And the British taxed salt, and not only did they tax salt, well, they did a lot of other things. You know it. But Gandhi's argument was that salt is one commodity that everybody needs, and the poor people need it more than the rich. And his argument to the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, was British policies about salt, not the tax part, that's fine, are unjust because it has the poor people carry a differential load, differential burden, because they need more salt, because they work out in the field. You know? So he said, this is an unjust taxation, because it taxes the poor more than it does the rich. No? And he said, I ask you, Lord Irwin, to repeal that. And he said, oh no, yeah, what, you're going to take me on salt? Do it. No? And he said, okay. And what does he do? He walks to the sea 240 miles. Do you do that in a day? 24 days. Begins with 78 followers, and he announces, I'm going to reach the sea and make salt and defy this unjust law. And you know, at the end of the first day, how many people were walking with him? A few thousand. End of the second day, tens of thousands. And you can imagine he had invited reporters in advance, so he asks them, no? They're reporting, oh, you wouldn't believe it, 50,000 people marching with him, men, women, you know, Hindu, Muslims, Dalits and Brahmins, and gee, why are they walking? Salt. Oh, the British taxes salt in India? A lot of people, this was a revelation. The debates in the US Parliament, US Congress, and the British Parliament about, gee, we tax salt. Ha! And this builds. The third day and the fourth day and the fifth day, the 20th, you get the idea. And then he reaches the sea, and there are 8 million people, not with him, about 120,000 with him, but the others on India's 6,000 kilometer sea coast, making their own salt. And his statement all along was, I want world sympathy in this battle of right against might. Dandi was the place where he picked up salt. The date was 5th April 1930. Yeah, symbolic scaling. One more. Inner scaling, symbolic scaling, and how are we doing on time? Maybe we should skip generative scaling. Maybe we should leave it for questions and answers. It's called generative scaling. When we think of scaling, we make a fundamental assumption. And you know, it makes sense. And that is, we've already got something which we want to scale. And that's fine. You know, clearly that makes sense. But what about scaling something which we don't even have? You're saying, what? Oh, that's a silly idea. Maybe not. So I was involved in this project, so you know, I can say a little about this. About 10 years ago, an organization in South Africa called Soul City. Anybody here who knows of Soul City? Right? Oh, yeah. We need to scale this notion of who knows about scales. Soul City, Scale City. So, it's a phenomenal organization. They have been in existence for the last 20 years. They have a very popular ongoing television soap opera called Soul City, which is also broadcast on radio in 9 different languages, blah, blah. I mean, you know, it's a multimedia strategy directed at raising social issues. And in the year 2000, 1999 actually, they decided to address the issue of domestic violence. Big problem, not just in South Africa, but everywhere. And research, I was involved in this research, we did this formative research, showed us that there were 3 basic scripts that were operating. 3 basic stories that people were living out. The men, if you're talking about dispute between partners, felt in control in a situation such as this. And they felt in control and embodied this control by, you know, let's say you have a little drink or a big drink. You come into your home, you know, shut the curtains and close the door, and you think that now I'm in my ship. And I'm the captain of the ship, and I can do anything I want. That was one script, one story that the men were enacting, embodying, when there was domestic violence. The woman, the abused, the victim, whatever you may call it, call her, there was a flip script. She felt very helpless, out of control in her own home. So much so that she would never even ask for help, even though she was crying out for help. And you can perhaps ask why that was the case. Why was that the case? Why was the woman not crying out for help? Why was she enacting the script? Because?
There's no one to call to.
Because?
There's no one to call to.
No one to call to. Well, maybe she could have a conversation with her mother, maybe. Confide in her. And what does the mother say? The mother says, my child, endure. Work a little harder, maybe, on your marriage. No? You've got to keep your family together. Maybe he beats you because he likes you. It'll pass. He's going through a stressful time at work. It'll pass. So she wanted help, but
5 minutes?
That's the script.
5 minutes.
Oh yeah, okay, good, we're good. Plenty, no? 5 for me. We'll rewrite their script. And the neighbors were living another script, another story. And that story was, heck, we can't do anything. It's a private matter between husband and wife. We can't interfere. So this, these are norms, scripts that people are living. And this script plays itself out on a soap opera that's watched on prime time in South Africa. And one day, while viewers are tuned in, the script changes. Because authorship, pen, is very generative. It can move in any direction it wants. So while Tabang, this respected school teacher, is trying to beat his wife Matlakala, and the cycle of violence is escalating, the neighbors this time decide to do something. They come out of their homes armed with their pots and pans. And they stand outside the abuser's home and beat them. Now, this story, this script, was not part of the repertoire of behaviors that South Africans engaged in, but it was generated on a television screen. And you can ask the question, does the man now feel that he's in control? He's the captain of the ship, or has the private become public? What do you think the woman feels? Does she think that there's nobody to help her, or does she get a sense that, And what do the neighbors? Yeah, the scripts have been flipped. New scripts have been generated, have been modeled on the media. So does it surprise us then that we begin to hear about communities, who've begun to, and does it surprise us when we begin to hear about schools where little children, 60 of them, when the teacher was about to spank one of them, the rest of the 59, and you ask the question, where did they learn this from? New scripts have been generated and modeled. So these are some wicked scaling considerations. Carry small things with great love, and of course Einstein. If scaling is about measurement, then thank you very much.
I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. I didn't have the heart to stop. I'm really sorry there's no questions, but. But I have to say, what an amazing contrast. You have, you know, Martin really providing the nuts and bolts of what something could really look like on a day-to-day basis. Like, what are the things you should be spending your energy on, your time on? What do people do? How do you do this? And then you are been talking about what are the philosophical underpinnings that you really need to be thinking about that would really help you come to new creative solutions. Because this is really about, it's not necessarily about development becoming like business or development becoming like Gandhi. This is about figuring out something new, thinking creatively, and I think it'd be really, really great for you guys to really think about what you've learned, especially over the African program staff time, about all the things that are actually coming and going in the system right now and what we're dealing with overseas. And then overlapping this, think about how these fit together and how this moves us towards something different. And this is really all about getting to something new and getting those concrete solutions to come out. So, thank you. Big hand of applause for our wonderful speakers.